Hello, everyone, and welcome to our event, NATO Enlargement and Turkey's Partnership with the West, organized by LSE Contemporary Turkish Studies and LSE Ideas. My name is Yaprak Gürsoy, and I'm Professor of European Politics and Chair of Contemporary Turkish Studies at LSE. Tonight, we will discuss Turkey's past and future role within NATO in light of the organization's 75th anniversary, the war in Ukraine, the current challenges the community is facing, and its recent enlargement. A selection of brief notes before we start. This event is being recorded, and we are planning to make it available as a podcast and as a YouTube video later on. If you're posting about this event online tonight, please use hashtag LSE Turkey. And after our speakers, each of whom will have around 15 minutes, we are going to open the floor for questions. You can ask your questions to the speakers by using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens. I will read out the questions, and I will try to read out as many questions as possible. Please also let us know your name and affiliation. After these brief technical notes, let me give some background information about this panel. The first idea to organize an event on this topic actually came from Dr. Selin Nasi, who is a visiting fellow at the European Institute. We discussed this idea also with Dr. Buğra Süsler, who is a lecturer at UCL and the head of Turkey and the World Program at LSE Ideas. I would like to thank both Selin and Buğra for their contributions in organizing this panel. Although you cannot see them, they are actually in the audience and they are also watching. 2024 marks NATO's 75th anniversary. And the main idea of this panel is to look at the recent changes the community went through in the aftermath of the war in Ukraine. Enlargement plays an important role in these changes, and in the recent years, Turkey's role within NATO came under scrutiny as a result of Finland and Sweden's applications to join NATO. Turkey had reservations regarding the candidacy of these countries due to incompatible understandings of security, and especially due to differences in the extradition of individuals defined by Turkey as terror suspects. In the NATO summit in the summer of 2022, Turkey withdrew its objections in exchange for Sweden and Finland's pledge to take steps to address Turkey's concerns over terrorism. In April 2023, Turkey approved Finland's membership, but with Sweden incidents such as the burning of the Quran in front of the Turkish embassy in Stockholm continued to strain relations. A breakthrough in relations perhaps came about last summer when President Erdogan met with NATO General Secretary and the Swedish Prime Minister at the NATO summit in Madrid. And yesterday, I'm sure many of you have already heard, coincidentally, the Turkish parliament ratified Sweden's membership in NATO. I wanted to give this background information on recent developments with regard to NATO enlargement and recent debates about Turkey's role and Turkey's position in NATO. However, I'd like to stress that in this panel, we're not actually going to talk about these developments necessarily from the point of view of contemporary events that are happening. What we want to do is to provide you with a broader understanding of NATO's changing role in European security, as well as Turkey's contributions and role in it. Our first speaker will be Tacan İldem, who is a retired Turkish diplomat and who served as NATO Assistant Secretary General from 2016 to 2020. In 2020, Tacan İldem was appointed by NATO General Secretary as one of 10 independent experts to support a NATO 2030 initiative. Tonight, Tacan İldem will discuss the recent changes in NATO's deterrence and defense strategies before passing the torch on to our second speaker, Sinem Akgül Açıkmeşe. Sinem is Professor of International Relations and Jean Monnet Chair on Hybrid Threats in the EU at Kadir Has University. I'm also delighted to say that Sinem is a graduate of the European Institute at LSE, where Contemporary Turkish Studies is located. So welcome back to the EI, Sinem, although we are greeting you only through an online meeting. Sinem has written extensively on security and defense matters in Europe, including NATO and Turkey. And tonight she will discuss Turkey-NATO relations from this more historical and general perspective. Our final speaker will be Lizel Hinz, who is Assistant Professor of European and Eurasian Studies at Johns Hopkins SAIS. Lizel's expertise is on Turkey and its relations with Europe, the US, and the Middle East. Based on her monograph, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2018, Identity Politics Inside Out, where Lizel discusses identity contestation and foreign policy in Turkey. She will contextualize Turkey's relations with NATO from a broader perspective of Turkish national identity and foreign policy goals. Now, I'm delighted to hand over to our first speaker, Tajan İldem, for his talk.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to this webinar. In fact, I'm delighted to join such a panel composed of such a distinguished moderator and panelists. Not the usual format with gray-haired old man panel, but being the only male in this distinguished group of panelists, I'm really privileged. So let me thank the LSE Contemporary Turkish Studies and LSE Ideas for bringing all of us on this timely webinar. You told that our main purpose is not perhaps to focus on the latest ratification process by Turkey of Sweden's application to NATO. However, I think the timing of this panel is really something that we have to praise you for selecting the date. Now, for nearly 75 years, the bond between Europe and North America has made NATO the strongest alliance in history. NATO allies are bound by shared history, values, and goals. And sometimes the importance of these values are neglected. Together, allies work to prevent conflict and preserve peace for almost 1 billion people. Their solemn commitment to each other is that an attack against one ally is an attack against all. And this bond guarantees NATO allies security and prosperity and allows them to live their lives in freedom. The strength of NATO is that despite differences among allies, and we all know that from time to time these differences pop up, they have always been able to unite around their core task, to defend each other and keep their people safe. North America and Europe must stand strong and united in NATO, and unity among allies is more important than ever as they face the biggest security crisis since World War II, caused by Russia's war in Ukraine. Now, since the illegal and illegitimate annexation of Crimea by Russia, NATO was in fact successful in adapting itself by adoption of a series of military measures. So we can say that since 2014, it was able to have its military adaptation properly. Lots of effort was made in that respect. But when we came to 2019, the heads of government, heads of state and government, asked the Secretary General to launch a forward-looking reflection process, which necessitated him to commission an independent experts group in the beginning of 2020. And I was among the 10 experts. And again, the gender equality was preserved, 5 women, 5 men. And for almost 8 months, during the COVID circumstances, we were consulting and negotiating during this 8 months period by virtual meetings like this one, sometimes extending to 5 to 6 hours per day, to go through the security environment of that day and how we can project NATO's capacity and efficiency for 2030 and beyond. And we came up with a report entitled NATO 2030, United for a New Era, with almost 130, I think it was 138 concrete proposals. Some of them quite important, some of them for the machinery of the NATO headquarters, but still important. One very important one was to propose the drafting of a new strategic concept. And of course, during this reflection process, the Secretary General had the chance to consult with allies, also with the representatives of civic society and young generation. And he came up with NATO 2030 agenda. And the main features of this agenda could be highlighted with some themes like deeper political consultation and coordination, because we should not forget that NATO is a politico-military alliance. And I have already touched upon what NATO had achieved after 2014 with its military adaptation. But the purpose of this reflection process and NATO 2030 agenda was also to strengthen the political dimension of NATO. So deeper political consultation and coordination is quite an essential element of it. Strengthen deterrence and defense, because we cannot just lay back and say, well, we have already done our homework insofar as military adaptation is concerned. It requires a constant watch regarding the threat assessments and how NATO could be fit for the purpose. Improved resilience. Resilience has become a key word. And when we talk about resilience, it is more than what governments and their agencies could do. It's a whole society, whole of society endeavor. We require a societal resilience on a number of issues. Another issue is preservation of the alliance's technological edge, because more and more what we see is that innovation and emerging and disruptive technologies are becoming both as a threat multiplier, but also providing opportunities. Another area was to uphold the rules-based international order, boosting of training and capacity building, combating and adapting to climate change, investing in NATO, and certainly one important element which featured in NATO Secretary General's agenda was also to prepare a new strategic concept. NATO leaders adopted this new strategic concept at the Madrid summit in June 2022. I was NATO at the time when I was serving as Turkey's permanent representative at the North Atlantic Council, when we were discussing the previous strategic concept. which was adopted in 2011. But since 2011, many things have changed. Therefore, NATO required a new document. NATO strategic concepts are one of the most important documents that guide alliances' efforts in all spheres of its work. It sets out the alliance's priorities, core tasks, and approaches for the next decade. And the concept describes the security environment facing the alliance, reaffirms the values that bond allies to each other, and spells out NATO's key purpose of ensuring collective defense. It further sets out NATO's three core tasks of deterrence and defense, crisis prevention and management, and cooperative security. The concept, the recently adopted concept, makes clear that Russia poses the most significant and direct threat to our security. And the other threat that strategic concept confirms is terrorism. According to the concept, terrorism in all its forms and manifestations is the most direct asymmetric threat to the security of the citizens of allied nations and to international peace and prosperity. The strategic concept also dealt with China, and it states that China's coercive policies challenge our interests, security, and values. China has not been displayed as a new threat to NATO. As we speak, China is not posing a direct military threat to NATO, but certainly it is a challenge. But we also see the opportunities that we can reap the benefits of, like engaging with China on possible arms control negotiations, since arms control is one area going through a real stress test with the dysfunctioning of the existing instrument. The concept also talks about climate change and states that it is a defining challenge of our time. It also sets out NATO's joint position on countering cyber and hybrid threats and countering terrorism. And I have to say a few words about the summit meeting that took place last year in Vilnius. And the leaders took further major steps to strengthen the alliance's defense and deterrence for the long term across all domains and against all threats and challenges. When I say all domains, we used to focus only on land, maritime, and air, but now we have cyber, we have space. So all domain approach and 360-degree approach is essential. They agreed the most comprehensive defense plans since at the end of the Cold War, designed to counter the two main threats of our alliance, as I said, Russia and terrorism. To execute these plans, NATO is putting 300,000 troops on higher readiness, backed by substantial air and naval power. NATO allies are also increasing their stockpiles of munitions and equipment using their long-standing NATO defense planning process to provide industry with the long-term demand signal needed to boost their production. In Vilnius, NATO leaders also endorsed a new defense production action plan to aggregate demand, boost capacity, and increase interoperability, which is essential for the good functioning of our armed forces. You touched upon Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, which still continues to rage on. Russia has amassed a large missile stockpile ahead of winter, and we see new attempts to strike Ukraine's power grid and energy infrastructure. Moscow has brought death and destruction to the heart of Europe, seeking to destroy Ukraine and also bring about divisions among allies. President Putin probably made two big mistakes, and they are strategic mistakes. The first one is for him to totally underestimate Ukraine's determination, and the second, underestimate NATO's unity. NATO's main tasks are to support Ukraine's right to self-defense and also prevent escalation. That's what NATO is trying to do right now. At the Vilnius summit, NATO leaders set out a clear vision for Ukraine's future with a strong package of political and practical support. They reaffirmed that Ukraine will become a member of NATO and that an invitation will be issued for Ukraine to join NATO when allies agree that conditions are met. Of course, they also reiterated their decision they took in Bucharest in 2008. Now, few words on the enlargement, since you, in your introductory remarks, made it clear that NATO, with its enlargement, has strengthened its security. And Turkey has been for a long time, it was a long-standing stand of Turkey to support enlargement. And that was the case for the enlargement aspirations of many countries in the Balkans, in our neighborhood, like Georgia and Ukraine. And in principle, Turkey didn't have objections from enlargement point of view, the accession ambitions of both Finland and Sweden. But one has to recognize the fact that Turkey had legitimate security concerns. And when a candidate country or aspiring nation is about to join NATO, it has to address all security concerns of each individual ally already within NATO. Therefore, when Turkey expressed its objections due to its sensitivities and very legitimate sensitivities regarding fight against terrorism, perhaps some thought that Turkey was a spoiler. They were expecting both countries to become NATO members instantly. But we have to recognize the fact that, in fact, both Sweden and Finland were on fast track. It was expedited. The process was expedited due to the security circumstances. And let us not forget that, for instance, North Macedonia could be able to join NATO after 12 years of its expectations to become a NATO member due to one ally's objections on the country's name. Therefore, sometimes Turkey, and this brings me to my very final point, and I think it would be a good lead into Sinem Hoca's presentation, since she will be talking about Turkey's role in NATO. Sometimes Turkey is perceived as a so-called spoiler without people really trying to understand the security concerns of the country. One may talk about this process was handled by the government, and one may also come up with certain criticism as to the handling of it. But all in all, we should be on the same page that Turkey's expressed concerns were legitimate. And Turkey's perception as spoiler also is a function of Turkey's bilateral relations with some of the individual allies. And when these relations, bilateral relations, are strained, it creates a certain dynamic to Turkey's policies and role that it plays within NATO, and also it influences the perception of NATO in the eye of the Turkish public opinion, but also Turkey's image in the eyes of our friends within the alliance. So I stop here. Perhaps we can elaborate during the Q&A session.
Thank you very much for that introduction to the panel as well. And Sinem, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Yaprak. Thank you very much for inviting me to this webinar. I'm really happy to be back at LSE, even in this panel online. I wish to be there. I always wish to be there. And I also would like to thank to Ambassador İldem, because it has been a great lead about Turkey's perception as a spoiler. But it's not an easy task to talk after him, since he served at the highest levels of NATO, and also took part in shaping Turkey's role at NATO. I'm going to talk about Turkey's position within NATO, Turkey's role within NATO. There's a tendency to talk about NATO-Turkey relations, but it's not exactly a bilateral relationship. Turkey has been a part of NATO since 1952, but it is a reflection of sometimes politicians or policymakers to see Turkey as an outsider, but not an organic part of the alliance. But it's not the case. It's not kind of a relationship with the institution, but a role with reciprocity about contributions, Turkey's contribution to NATO, NATO's contribution to Turkey. As Tacan Bey mentioned, Turkey is perceived as a spoiler, especially within the recent crisis. I'm going to talk about those crises in the alliance that are related to Turkey, specifically the policies that included Turkey's vetoes or veto probabilities. Turkey's role within NATO has been prone to many crises, and the latest Swedish membership has been the most controversial one. But this is not the first crisis, and I will be talking about those crises. However, I have to mention that Turkey is one of NATO's most active members, a great military power, contributes to NATO's military power, its actions, its military exercises. First of all, let me talk about the contributions of both sides, as this was my task to talk about. Turkey, by being a member of NATO, became linked to the Western institutions and the transatlantic security community since 1952. And throughout the Cold War years, Turkey served as one of the providers of security in the southern flank. Since then, Turkey has been contributing a lot to NATO. For instance, Turkey is hosting some of the portions of NATO, the Allied Land Command in Izmir, an headquarter in Istanbul, a military headquarter, and also the radar system in Kürəcik as a part of NATO's ballistic missile defense system. So I mean, this is the responsibility of a member country for sure, but I'm just trying to mention the ways in which Turkey contributes to NATO as part of NATO. Turkey also has been a significant contributor to NATO's out-of-area operations. Since the end of the Cold War, NATO's Article 5 operations are not that relevant, and NATO has started to function as an out-of-area security provider with peacekeeping missions elsewhere in the world, and the most important ones being in the Balkans. Turkey has contributed to the forces I4, S4, K4, also the operations in Macedonia for providing stability or to help enforcing and sustaining peace. So Turkey has been a reliable partner of NATO, of the alliance in the Balkans. It's not only the Balkans, for sure. Turkey provided its support in NATO's operation in Afghanistan to ISAF by providing personnel and equipment, and took a very important role in the region. Also, Turkey provided support to NATO in the operation in the Mediterranean against terrorism, and also against piracy, the Operation Ocean Shield against piracy. So these are just reflections, these are just examples of Turkey demonstrating its loyalty to NATO by assisting the alliance and showing that it has a role in the post-Cold War security environment. But it's not a one-sided story. It's also reciprocal, as I mentioned, and NATO also has contributed to Turkish security. For instance, Turkey has asked NATO to invoke Article 4, the consultation mechanism, in its operations against, or in the threats against Turkey in Iraq, in Syria, in many instances, specifically in Turkey's cross-border operations. I mean, against Turkey's, the threats Turkey faced with the Suruç bombings in ISIS, or Turkey facing some threats and when Turkish soldiers were killed in Idlib, Turkey requested consultations from NATO. And in some of those instances, there were, of course, verbal support from NATO, support in discourse, but in some, NATO decided to launch some operations in order to support Turkey. And one final thing about contributions to both sides, with the war in Ukraine, Turkey has become an important ally yet again because of its, I mean, this geostrategic position, or let me just specify it with Turkey's the rights that Turkey has with the Montreux Convention, and the fact that Turkey has such rights made Turkey an indispensable ally in this case. So these are the cooperation mechanisms or collaboration mechanisms that Turkey and NATO has faced over the years in the historical context. Now, let me touch upon a few cases of crisis where Ambassador İldem talked about Turkey being a spoiler. actually, throughout the Cold War, if you're looking into history, there were not that major crises except the US weapons embargo on Turkey. Let me just mention here with a parenthesis that in Turkey, there's a tendency, not in Turkey, but in most parts of, mostly scholars, dealing Turkey's role within NATO and confusing it with Turkey's relations with the US because of some just reasons, for sure. It's not the case, but maybe we could just, it's not always the case, but it is mostly the case. So it's a very confused web of relationships. So the crisis, the major crisis, was the US weapons embargo on Turkey throughout the Cold War years. That was the only major crisis, let me put it that way. Another, after the Cold War, with the end of the Cold War, one unsolved major crisis is the Cyprus debacle. I'm going to talk about some existential crisis that exists between NATO and Turkey, and one of them is Cyprus. In 2004, Cyprus became a member of the EU, and that ignited a major discussion. After the Big Bang enlargement of the EU, which included Central and Eastern European countries, Cyprus and Malta, NATO has offered them to get included in the Partnership for Peace program. The countries in Central and Eastern Europe would be part until they joined NATO, and Malta and Cyprus were invited. But Turkey rejected the fact that Cyprus could be a member, could be a part of that Partnership for Peace initiative. And Turkey also opposed to the conclusion of an intelligence agreement between NATO and Cyprus. That was a deal within the context of Cyprus being a member of the EU and EU-NATO cooperation. So this became a very strange triangle of security issues in Europe. And one other challenge in this debacle, in the Cyprus debacle, is that US has recently lifted defense trade restrictions on Cyprus, and that keeps antagonizing Turkey. I will give some more examples, some more crises which Turkey has tried to use its veto card, but then the crises are solved somehow. Turkey's vetoes are generally solved, are resolved. Those crises are resolved. Maybe behind doors, as a scholar, I don't have access how they are resolved. But at the end of the day, there are some existential ones that are not resolved, and I will mention them at the end of my talk. But one of the crises that was solved between Turkey and NATO was known as the Rasmussen crisis. Turkey in 2009 vetoed the appointment of Rasmussen as NATO's Secretary General, the former Prime Minister of Denmark, because of a controversy against Islam, the portrayal of Prophet Muhammad in a cartoon. And at the time, Prime Minister Erdogan asked Rasmussen to talk to the leaders of the Muslim world and apologize. And also, Turkey asked Denmark to ban the broadcasting related to PKK. They were not accepted, and Turkey at the time vetoed, but the crisis was resolved, and at some point, Rasmussen became the Secretary General. As far as I remember, maybe Ambassador İldem would correct me if I'm wrong, the first Assistant Secretary General, Turkish Assistant Secretary General, was appointed Hüseyin Diriöz at the time. Another crisis is related to Israel and also Egypt, both having the same context. Both countries were to be part of NATO's partnership mechanisms. Also, Israel participation to NATO's military exercises, but Turkey vetoed. With Israel, it was the 1 minute crisis and then the Mavi Marmara incident, and Turkey blocked the cooperation mechanisms between Israel and NATO within the context of the Mediterranean dialogue. Things began to change with the Syrian war, Syrian civil war, and in that case, Turkey, in order to deal with the crisis in its border, Turkey asked for Patriot missiles, missile batteries from NATO. And this somehow became linked to Turkey's lifting of its veto against Israel and NATO's approval of deployment of Patriot missile batteries to Turkey. And this was solved somehow. Israel became a part of NATO's cooperation and partnership mechanism, and Israel joined NATO's exercises and opened the communication office in NATO's headquarters. The same context goes for Egypt as well. Turkey vetoed the participation of Egypt in NATO's military exercises because of its troubled relationships with Egypt. But then since in 2021, kind of a detente in Turkey-Egypt relations, and Turkey lifted its veto, and NATO revised its partnership program with Egypt. Another crisis, which I would call an existential one, is about the different definitions of terrorism of some NATO members and also Turkey. And this is related to mostly the US. I should mention that because, as I mentioned, it's a perception in Turkey to equate Turkey's relations with US with Turkey's role in NATO. Since 2015, issues of northern Syria increased tensions in transatlantic relations, especially Turkey's relations with the States. US has supported PYD, YPG, and Turkey conducted, as you know, cross-border operations in northern Syria, also against the YPG forces. And this has been a kind of a major deadlock in the relations due to differentiated views on the definition of terrorist organizations. Even though PKK is defined as a terrorist organization by the EU, by US, it's not YPG or PYD. So this definition, differences of opinions on the definition of terrorism is somehow an existential crisis, and it doesn't stop. It's not resolved. One of the unresolved issues is Cyprus. One other is this definition of terrorism. Another crisis was averted in 2019. That was the defense plan for Baltics and Poland. After one of Turkey's cross-border operations, Finland, Sweden, Germany, France, and some other NATO members has limited weapons export to Turkey. And in return, Turkey decided to block the defense plan for Baltics and Poland. I mean, NATO trying to transform itself against the possible potential Russian threat. And of course, it is a response to the Russian aggression and in the region. So Turkey asked for recognition of PYD and YPG as terrorist organizations by NATO. This was not accepted. But I don't know how, but this crisis was again resolved and Turkey lifted its objection in 2020.
Sinem, shall we
Okay,
perhaps wrap up now?
Just the
There are
final
too many
crisis.
If you go through the
Yes.
entire list.
But this is the one. This is the
Oh,
most
this is the final
recent
one.
one, the
Okay,
final
all right.
one, and everybody is, curious about this recent crisis. It is the Finland and Sweden accession to NATO, and in order to conclude, I have to say that it is resolved. So Turkey lifted its objection to the accession of Finland, and Finland became a member. And Turkey lifted its objection to the membership of Sweden, and we are looking forward to what will happen next. Erdogan's approval, and then the approval of Hungary, and then we'll see if Sweden will become a member or not, but it is highly likely that Sweden will be another member of NATO. So my point here is that one way or another, the crises are solved between Turkey and NATO, but there are some existential ones that are on the agenda, on the shelves, and they are existential. The issue of Cyprus, the definition of terrorism, and of course, I didn't touch upon that, but maybe we could extend that while we are doing the Q&A session, S-400 and Turkey's relations with Russia. So 3 points: Cyprus, terrorism, and Turkey's relationship with Russia, and that, ups and downs in Turkey's relationship with Russia are the ones that complicate Turkey's role within NATO. So I end it here, and I would be happy with the questions.
Yeah, there's already a question on the S-400s, but we are going to start getting more questions, I hope. So while we're listening to our last speaker, if you have any questions, please feel free to type them, and we'll get to them after all of our speakers have spoken. Lizel, now I think you are going to provide us with some background information on Turkish national identity that can explain some of these crises that Sinem has explained as existential ones.
Thank you so much. And I want to echo the thanks to the organizers for hosting this, for inviting me. It's a great honor to be on this panel with such distinguished speakers, and to follow both of you is quite a task. But in fact, I think I'll, in my comments, try to pick up on Sinem Hoca's mention of the S-400 issue. And I think there was, as you said, a question Selin Nasi had posted in the Q&A on that. So I was asked both to sort of comment on the role of national identity, shifting national identities in Turkey's relationship with NATO, and then kind of situate Turkey-NATO relations within Turkish foreign policy more broadly, or Turkey relations with the West even in its foreign policy more broadly. So I especially appreciate Sinem Hoca's really important note that Turkey-West relations, Turkey-US relations, and Turkey-NATO relations are not the same thing. They complicate each other, for sure. And I think a lot of NATO members have been frustrated by some of the tensions with the US in particular. But I think it's quite useful to separate out the fact that bilateral relations are not the same as Turkey's participation within an organization in which it has contributed so much. And so I really appreciated the highlighting of Turkey's many contributions to NATO operations. In thinking about kind of the tensions and how the bilateral relationship with the US does in fact complicate NATO-Turkey relations, I think it's important to take a look at identity factors to identity contestation. So I really appreciated the highlighting of my book, my 2018 book on identity politics and foreign policy, because I think a lot of the challenges that have arisen between Turkey and Europe, where of course a lot of the NATO members lie, as well as Turkey and the US, are complicated by a shifting understanding of Turkey's role in the world, a shifting understanding of who its allies and enemies are, and a shifting understanding of the interlocutors whom it can trust that has happened with the coming to power of the AKP in 2002. It's not a shift that happens immediately, but through the sort of weakening of some of the, what I call the institutional obstacles to the AKP's understanding of Turkish national identity, what I call Ottoman Islamism, or at least I did in the book. I think that's changed to include a much more Turkish nationalist component since, say, 2015, 2016, the reinitiation with the war with the PKK, the coup attempt, the alliance with some Eurasianist Ulusalcılar elements as well. So it's evolved, but that understanding of identity that the AKP brings into power complicates relations with Europe, complicates relations with the West, and with the US in particular, in part because of perhaps incompatible understandings of Turkey's support of Palestine, of Palestinians, for example, and the US not necessarily understanding why Turkey, with the recent October 7th attacks by Hamas and Israel's response, the war in Gaza that is continuing in the escalating regional contestation, conflagration, and potential for spread, why Turkey has not taken a harder line on Israel, why the Turkish government has not agreed to define Hamas as a terrorist organization, for example, why Turkey has supported Muslim Brotherhood organizations, had allowed Hamas to operate on its territory, for example. So there are some ties with Islamist organizations in the Middle East that has complicated Turkey's relationship with the US, and then that can also complicate Turkey's relationship with NATO. Of course, one of the challenges that we mentioned, the S-400 issue that has become a major point of contestation, not just with the US, but of course with NATO, given the incompatibility of the S-400 system, the potential threats to NATO technology that the S-400 could pose. There was an immense set of dialogues between US and Turkey interlocutors trying to dissuade Turkey from purchasing the S-400s. From, I think, a lot of Turkey's diplomats' perspectives and the messaging that was coming out of the AKP government was that the US was sort of forcing Turkey to turn to an alternative missile defense system because it would not sell the Patriot batteries. The Patriots, of course, that we've mentioned earlier that were stationed on Turkey's southern border by some of the NATO members. The fact that Turkey and the US could not agree on technology transfer, on information sharing and so forth, co-production, meant that Turkey sort of goes to Russia and engages in this S-400 purchase, which NATO was pushing, of course, very heavily against. Note that NATO had also been pushing heavily against Turkey's previous attempts to purchase a missile defense system from China. They had been successful in deterring Turkey from that purchase, but they were unsuccessful in the Russia case. So the fact that Turkey purchases this S-400 system is, I think, indicative of a number of concerns that are at the core of the AKP's foreign policy strategy that complicate relationships with NATO. And I think it's important to understand that just because Turkey is a member of NATO, the AKP does not see Turkey as part of a Western bloc, nor does it see it as part of an Eastern bloc or a Middle Eastern bloc or a pro-Russia bloc. I think the best way to understand this is a push for an autonomous, independent foreign policy, which really frustrates members of NATO when they say, why are you not behaving like an ally? You're a member of this collective defense organization. But the Turkish government's experiences have pushed it towards this autonomous, independent foreign policy, in part because of the fallout from the S-400 system that involve ramping up the domestic defense industry production system, for example. So of course, this has to do with the TB2 drones, which have become a major export for Turkey, and even a sense of sort of national pride, I think, amongst a lot of Turks. Didem Soyaltın Kolela and Tolgir Demiryol have a fantastic article on this sort of technological nationalism that Turkey is becoming known for. But there has been, for decades, a need to sort of create a very independent domestic defense industry that I think has been amped up and exacerbated. The need for that has been amped up by the S-400 fallout. But then there's also this sense that has been mentioned earlier that the US, that NATO more broadly, does not take what the AKP government defines as its legitimate security concerns seriously. The sense that there's condemnation of the Turkish military's airstrikes against the YPG in Syria and in Iraq. Part of that could be explained by security concerns. Part of that can also be explained by this rise in a Turkish nationalist understanding of identity. Often, I think when people think about security concerns, they think in relatively narrow terms of just threats. But to understand threats and make threat assessments, we have to understand who we think of as enemies and who we think of as allies. And that has shifted over time when it comes to, say, the AKP coming to power. And again, as I said, kind of turning towards partnering with Islamist actors in the region. Views towards Kurdish militant groups have also shifted in terms of whether they can be partners in a peace process or whether they need to be engaged with via military means. So I think identity motivations and national identity can help understand, again, this sort of shift towards partnering with actors that the US and Europe are not happy with, whether it's Russia, whether it's China. I think Ambassador İldem very nicely articulated that China, of course, does not pose any direct military threat to NATO members, but that there are serious concerns about the threats that it can pose in cyber and other arenas. So I think that's a really important point. Turkey, of course, is reliant upon, I should say, the Turkish government, the AKP, for the domestic, regional, or I should say, regime stability concerns, and dealing with economic crisis is reliant on Chinese investment, is very much has become a partner with China in terms of trade. China is actually the third. Turkey imports more from China than many other countries. It's third on its list after the EU and Russia. So this brings us, of course, to not just identity, but also economic concerns that are driving a lot of the foreign policy initiatives that are complicating relationships with NATO. So in addition to the S-400 issue with Russia, we see energy needs. Russia is about half of Turkey's gas imports. We see nuclear cooperation. We see tourism. There's a number of issues that mean that Turkey, for example, while it could play a mediator role between Ukraine and Russia, which I think won it quite a lot of acclaim from NATO, from the West more broadly, was not able to take a number of the steps that NATO wanted, was not able to take a number of the steps that the US in particular wanted, including direct sanctions on Russia. So it needs to keep these possibilities for energy, for future operations in northern Syria. Russia plays a large role in controlling what happens in northern Syria. So these ties with countries and actors like Russia, China, Hamas, and other actors that the US and NATO are not comfortable with Turkey partnering with are continuing to cause a lot of tensions and create discussions within DC. And these are, of course, not my discussions, but I'm speaking to you from DC, so I can give a little bit of the sentiment here that Turkey is not behaving as an ally, that it is not trustworthy, that it is not on board, that it in fact had a responsibility to fast track Sweden and Finland's membership. That's what a good ally would have done. And again, these are not my sentiments, but those sort of in the DC community. So the larger picture is that identity motivations domestic defense motivations, as well as economic and energy needs, are propelling Turkish foreign policy in directions that are increasingly complicating relations with, again, the West more broadly, but also within NATO, specifically with the S-400 issue. So I think it's important to understand the intersection of those economic and energy needs, the need for the AKP to stay in power and to sort of manage those, as well as its broader vision as a counter-hegemonic regional power, as well as pushing back at the US more broadly. Erdogan repeatedly says the UN is greater than 5. He wants to push back at what he sees as Western imperialism. And so, posturing about being able to sort of withhold membership for Sweden and Finland allows him to use an international stage to show that he's confronting those Western actors in ways that play well with domestic audiences whose votes he relies on, who are sympathetic to nationalist sentiments, to this sort of pushback against the West more broadly.
Sorry, I was on mute. Thank you very much, and thank you very much also for keeping within time. So we actually have 4 questions, and we have around 30 minutes. So I'm going to pose the questions, and then also we'll give you a chance to speak to one another if you want. So if you want to add anything to each other's presentations, please take the opportunity to do that in this first round. So Selin Nasi, who I've mentioned earlier, our colleague at the European Institute, has asked the question on the S-400s. And Lizette has already answered the question somewhat, but she's asking the question from the perspective of Turkey's quest for autonomy and its strategic realignments. So what are the limits of Turkey's strategic multi-alignment in the context of its relations with NATO? And perhaps Sinem and Tajan can answer that question. Emre Işık is a student from Turkey and from ODTÜ, the Middle East Technical University. He's asking if the participation of Israel to NATO, a very simple question. Do you think that NATO really needs Israel? And perhaps that's a question to Tajan as well. The third question is from Hafsa Fakher Elabiari, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing names here. They're a Turkey-based independent researcher and is asking a question about what are the aspects of Turkish foreign policy the US and the EU tend to overlook? I think Lisa has already answered that question a bit as well, but if the other speakers want to add anything to what is being overlooked, aside from Turkey's, for instance, security concerns, that will be brilliant. And the final question for the first round was actually posed in Turkish. This is a question that was asked by İlker Çelebi. But it's actually a valid question. The question is to Ambassador Tajan İldem, but I think everybody could answer this. What did Turkey gain by approving Sweden's enlargement, Sweden's application to NATO? Shouldn't have Turkey actually gained something more diplomatically from Sweden or from NATO? So perhaps we can extend this question to a secondary one with Sinem's crises, all the crises that you mentioned. If there's a backing down from these positions, does that make Turkey's position weaker overall and in the future? So maybe we can reply to the questions in the order that that you spoke. We can start, yeah.
Well, if I may, first of all, a couple of things regarding the acquisition of S-400s. It is something of a necessity for Turkey to look for a source to procure its requirement for air and missile defense. due to the threat assessments that we were having. We were receiving missiles within the borders of Turkey, and it was quite natural for us to seek ways and means to boost our defense in that respect. Now, if you ask my personal opinion, the acquisition of S-400s from Russia was a mistake. It was a mistake because the Turkish government at the time enumerated a number of criteria for the bidding process. And among them, three main elements were the delivery time, price, and technology transfer. Perhaps in terms of delivery time, the Russian system was okay. I don't think that it was quite cheap. We paid $2.5 billion. And third, I haven't seen any reference to joint production or technology transfer. On the contrary, when the Russian high-level officials were asked whether it was wise to share technology with a NATO member, the Russian officials said, well, no. We have made sure that nothing will be transferred in the technology area to Turkey. Now, what we gained with this acquisition, we were expelled from F-35 program, which was quite important for acquiring technology. Technology transfer is not done off-the-shelf purchase, but rather through collaborative arrangements. And F-35 program was providing Turkey the necessary technology base for its companies to earn, but also to accumulate this technological base. Now, we are very proud, as you rightly said, one of the speakers said, Lizel told about TB2 Bayraktar production. We all are very proud. The Turkish defense industry is booming, and it is good for the country, for not only supporting our defense, but also our foreign policy, implementing certain decisions. But when we put aside the purchase of S-400s, I think there is a sort of lack of understanding regarding the stand of Turkey. Sometimes it is being equated to a shift of axis. They say, oh my God, a NATO member shifting axis will be supporting Russia. Russia is a threat. What's happening? Well, this is an illusion. This is not real, because they should know that when I talked about the adaptation of NATO, all very important decisions to strengthen deterrence and defense of NATO, these decisions were made on a consensus basis, including Turkey's strong support of these decisions. So Turkey is not a loyal ally. What is Turkey doing? This is not really a realistic discussion. I give you one very interesting example. Once I was asked by an important think tank in London, London-based think tank, to speak on Turkey's stand vis-a-vis the ongoing war in Ukraine. And I asked who would be attending together with me. Am I the only one? Or no. You will be invited with a representative from India. I said, India? But why? Well, we know the Russian position. We know the NATO position, but we don't know non-aligned position, and Turkey and India could reflect on that. I said, well, excuse me, I'm not coming to that meeting. Then they changed the format. I briefed them about Turkey's stand. Well, Sinem Hoca referred to some of the crises. She mentioned 1975 US arms embargo. but we can go back to 1964 when we had the Johnson letter, which created enormous damage on Turkey-US relations. Then came 1975 sanctions, which was repeated and replicated with CAATSA sanctions. But the perceptions are something not uniform. In the United States, I agree. Maybe when you walk in the corridors of the Congress, you may hear these sentiments, very negative views about Turkey and its role in NATO. But what about walking in the corridors of the Turkish National Assembly, or the man in the street, bipartisan, without any political affiliation, to view the United States as a major ally of Turkey, not to be supportive of Turkey on an existential question, fighting against terrorism. Now, I mean, it is not a secret. When you Google or in the YouTube, you have the testimony at the US Congress of the former Defense Secretary. I think he passed away, Ashton Carter, talking about the fact that YPG, PYD are the extension of PKK. And we also have the footage of a four-star general, US general, again, while testifying, saying, well, Turks were so sensitive about PKK and the relationship between PKK and PYD, YPG, we asked them to change their name. They included another group, and all of a sudden, they changed their name to Syrian Democratic Forces. So we solved the problem. But you can't solve problems as such. I'm really quite concerned that throughout years, because Turkey and the United States could not sit down and talk seriously on these very important differences, the very fabric of our relations have been damaged. I hope they could be repaired, because when we talk about the political dimension of NATO, the importance of consultations, coordination, first it comes with efficient consultations between allies. You cannot just sweep the problems under the carpet. They have to be discussed and resolved. If Turkey, while addressing such an existential threat, not seeing its major ally, the United States, eye to eye, it's frustrating. Maybe it is frustrating for the United States to see Turkey purchasing S-400s, but for Turkey, it's a bipartisan view, not to see the United States to be understanding about the concerns of Turkey regarding fighting against terrorism is something very important. And
I'm mindful of the time because we have
Sure. One point that I would also like to emphasize is that sometimes Turkey's objections are also put in the context of the perceptions of perhaps the current government or the orientation of Turkey, whether there is a change in its orientation. But when we look historically, if one expects Turkey not to have any engagement with Russia, it would be rather a big mistake, because even during the Cold War years, the right-wing governments, I remember Demirel government signing agreements with the Soviet Union for them to take part in the heavy industry construction work. aluminum, steel plants, refineries, all were built by the Soviet Union at the time, although those governments were extremely critical and very sensitive with the policies of the Soviet Union. So the geographical location of Turkey is given that we cannot change. But in any case, what I need to emphasize, take advantage of this conversation is for allies to be more open and candid. There is a American saying to talk Turkey, and I think allies should talk Turkey and be able to address all serious issues that they may have, because they always had such differences in the past, like the Suez Canal crisis, like the 2003 Iraq episode. But one way or another, they could be able to overcome these. And for Sweden and Finland, I think what we haven't achieved yet, there may be certain things we still expect Sweden to deliver, but the trilateral mechanism established in Madrid, the bilateral arrangement we have established in Vilnius is an ongoing mechanism. And that's why Turkey and Sweden should be able to utilize all means of diplomacy. That would include state institutions like prosecutors, judges, exchange of visits, and to better understand what each other's concerns and sensitivities are. And it is first and foremost important for Turkey and the United States to sit down and to discuss things properly and to eliminate all unnecessary irritants. And I'm sorry, but they are becoming more than irritants, real problems.
I mean, Selin actually has a question on trust. So what you're touching upon is like rebuilding of trust through open and candid conversation. So Sinem, would you be able to answer some of the questions in a couple of minutes, because there are also other questions. Most of them are related to Sweden's membership in NATO, but I still want to go over the questions if we have time left. So please, if you can answer the questions from the first round.
Okay, I'll be brief. I hope to be brief as much as I could. First of all, the question about Selin's question about Turkey's strategy of multi-alignment, and Tajan Bey has linked this question to the perception of access, shift of access in a wrong way, the perception in a wrong way. Yes, indeed, I totally agree. S-400 did not shift Turkey's access. Actually, I would like to tie this question to a general perception of Turkish foreign policy in the historical context. There are ups and downs about Turkey's transatlantic or Western identity. I mean, there are times that Turkey connects itself to Middle East. There are times that Turkey has an Islamic identity. There are times that Turkey becomes trying to find itself in its Ottoman heritage. So different and various types of identities. But at the end of the day, Turkey never leaves its Western or transatlantic identity. And even though there are trust issues of both sides, I mean, in terms of NATO, Turkey's role in NATO, the trust issue right now is tied to S-400 on one hand, and Turkey's definition of terrorism, and Turkey cannot getting a support of this of its own definition of what it's experiencing. So this is kind of my comment on the first question. Secondly, Emre's question on Israel. Maybe I could correct what I have said. It's not membership. It's not talk about membership. It's Israel's cooperation with NATO. And that cooperation is, of course, needed because of the region's problematic region's challenges, let me put it that way. And that cooperation in the Mediterranean is somehow needed. And this is Israel's participation to some of NATO's exercises, some other types of collaboration and contact. Of course, contact is needed as NATO is after the end of the Cold War, having a new regional mindset and opening itself to other regions as well. So it is important to have partners in the region. To the question on the ways in which US and the EU tend to overlook when it comes to Turkish foreign policy, I could talk lots about EU's tending to overlook what is happening in Turkey. But here, maybe I could say that both actors, US and the EU, are overlooking the perceptions of public perceptions in Turkey who are attaching themselves to the Western identity, especially the EU. Specifically, the EU in that sense. However, EU in that trust issue, EU does not trust Turkey because of its backsliding, democratic backsliding. Turkey does not trust the EU because of EU's, the recent one, EU's position in the Eastern Mediterranean, being in solidarity with Cyprus and Greece. And so this is what the EU tends to overlook, Turkey's rights arising out of international law in the Eastern Mediterranean, and at times EU's hypocrisy. So in a nutshell, these are my answers to this question, but both actors are overlooking the fact that Turkey has also faces in Europe, in West, in the transatlantic region. And finally, Sweden, what we have gained, there's an expectation about a package of F-16 jets and also the upgrade kits for F-16. So it is an expectation of defense. There's an expectation of acquisitions of defense industry. However, it is the all approval process that we are going to experience from now on. And it's the US Congress trying to link this to the actual membership of Sweden, and Turkish part trying to get this after this approval. So I cannot make any guesses at this stage, but this is the expectation, and this is how it is supposed to resolve according to my limited knowledge on the topic.
Perfect. And thank you very much for that, because Friedrich, PhD student at the European Institute, Friedrich Putman, had asked what is the most likely explanation for how the Turkey-Sweden NATO crisis was resolved today. And I think you've also answered that question by saying that there are expectations that Turkey will receive certain defense capabilities as a result of this approval. Okay, Lizel.
Yeah, I'll try to link a bunch of questions together in the limited time we have. So in terms of what Turkey gets, I would say that in fact the crisis has not yet been resolved. I think the Sweden-NATO crisis has not yet been resolved, given the timely nature of this panel, of course. And I always say that every day is a timely day to talk about Turkey, but goodness, given the Turkish parliament's actions yesterday, that's certainly the case. But Erdogan hasn't signed it yet. And, he's said that he is going to, he's expected to. Orban even posted on X that, he will then, he has also expressed support. So they seem to be moving in lockstep. But President Erdogan's actions have been, I think, deliberately incremental. as a way to open space for pushing the US, the Biden administration in particular, to put pressure on Congress. And the objections coming from Congress are not those that the Biden administration can resolve quite quickly. It's not just the Congress objection to the purchase of the S-400, that's part of it. It's also explicitly stated objections by even the former head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that they're concerned about Turkey's democratic system, about the imprisonment of political activists, of civil society leaders, of political party members, and so forth. So there's wider concerns other than the S-400 and, of course, Turkey's objection to Sweden's membership. So just moving ahead on this and getting Parliament to ratify it doesn't necessarily mean that the F-16s will be forthcoming. I think the question of what do we get is a really important one. We don't know is the answer. We don't know what progress has been made in terms of trying to get Congress to approve. And it's possible that the Biden administration could have put more pressure on, could have said, you know, you need to take one for the team and lift those objections. And, you know, Sweden's NATO membership is more important and so forth. We just don't know at this point, but we do know that Congress has been proving to be the major obstacle in this, not Biden's wishes, but rather Congress's objections. And again, those are multiple. I will say, however, that I think it's really important to note the context in which Turkey initially raised its objection to NATO membership and what it's gotten. So the fact that Sweden and Finland kind of got caught up in this, it was more Sweden that I think was the main target, but made major changes to its domestic law in terms of crackdown on terrorism. So that is pretty, I mean, I don't know if impressive is the right word, but it's a big step for a country that had very, very liberal laws when it came to free speech, when it came to membership in organizations and so forth. So that's a pretty big shift, although it may not be as considered as significant in Turkey. But I think the context of when this objection was being raised is important. The sense that Turkey was able to use its veto power as a way not only to position itself on the international stage, again, you know, objecting to, say, NATO requests in order to kind of position itself as an important world player. That's a little bit of it. But if you go back, at the time, Turkey was warning about a ground incursion in Syria back in the winter of 2022. And I think one of the things that this objection was able to do was to sort of force the language of NATO members of Sweden and Finland, and particularly of the Secretary General, to take Turkey's legitimate security concerns seriously as the government put them forward, to recognize that the YPG is a security concern for Turkey, to recognize the links between the YPG and the PKK and so forth. And in doing so, that sort of prepares the rhetorical groundwork for any kind of military action that Turkey would have taken going forward. We know that they didn't receive the green light. A number of things sort of left that threatened military incursion unfulfilled, but the context in which it raised its objections, I think, was really important. In terms of the sort of issues that are overlooked, I think some of the issues that have been raised here are quite important regarding trust and potentially regarding the previous contentious issues, again, between the US and Turkey, partially between NATO and the US. So the Johnson letter was mentioned. I emphasize to my students in the US, like, you have to take the Johnson letter seriously. The extent to which there's a feeling of betrayal within Turkey, there's the sense of lingering frustration that an ally is not taking its security concerns seriously, will not only not have its back, but then places sanctions upon it. Same with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Same with the 2003, the Hooding incident. There are these repeated incidents in which Turks and the Turkish government and the population and the media spins narratives, is reporting and then is spinning narratives to sort of portray the US as this actor that is undermining Turkey's security interests. The extent to which Turkish government members and AKP members have blamed the US for the 2016 coup contribute to that. So there's this sense of distrust. There's this sense that the US can't be an ally that can be relied on or trusted, that I think shapes not only the government's interactions with NATO as an interlocutor, but also the domestic public's receptivity to any kind of pushback against NATO as, well, they're not serving, they're not protecting us, so why do we have to sort of adhere to the demands that they are placing on us? We are sovereign and we will defend our territory and our borders the way that we need to, and we will make our own defense policy and so forth. So I would just kind of, again, underline that issue of trust as something to be taken very seriously when it comes to Turkey and policy more broadly.
Thank you very much. I will give everyone, you guys, a chance to wrap up with maybe one sentence or two. But I will pose a question combining Zeynep Naz Birdal's question. Zeynep Naz is a master's student at USUL, and Çiğdem Çelik's question. Çiğdem is a postdoc in the Köln Center for Comparative Politics. So they're both asking a question, I think, about NATO in general. And we started this panel by talking about NATO in general and NATO's strategic concept and NATO's future strategy. So I think it would be worth closing this panel by reiterating perhaps the value of NATO and combining their questions. Zeynep Naz's and Çiğdem's questions, I think it is fair to pose what are the benefits of being a member of NATO? Is Turkey or other members sacrificing their interests and values by being part of NATO or a security community? And we only talked about Turkey, of course, but Hungary was in a very similar position to Turkey with regards to the recent enlargement. So we can ask perhaps, is Turkey the weakest link in NATO? Or are there other countries which have experienced similar crises? And how unique is Turkey's experience with NATO? So if you can answer these questions very briefly, we're going to end the panel. Lisa, maybe we'll start with you. We'll do the reverse round this time around.
All right, I'll do my best. So Turkey is absolutely by no means the weakest link or the weakest member in NATO. I think by any measurement. Does it pose a lot of tensions and frustrations and questions? Yes, it does. It frustrates me to see discussions in DC policy circles about ejecting Turkey from NATO, for example. First of all, there's no, of course, institutional mechanism for doing so. And also Turkey contributes an immense amount. And so I think really going back to Sinem Hoca's point about looking at the tensions between the US and Turkey as separate to those within or between Turkey and NATO, yes, they can overlap, but they're not inherently tied necessarily, of course, the S-400 being one of the exceptions. So in terms of the question of does Turkey's, has Turkey compromised its values or its interests? I think we have to be very clear about defining what those values and interests are. And I think that's the only way that we can kind of move forward in terms of thinking about whether there are common shared, perhaps security goals might be a better way of defining it rather than interests or values, because I think that kind of language gets very ambiguous. And I think that there's a lot of national pride that is tied up with words like values and interests and things. And I think if we can talk about more concrete, tangible issues on which perhaps, these actors can collaborate, that may be perhaps a more productive way rather than thinking about values and interests. And there is always an element of sovereignty that is given up or released or compromised when one joins an international organization, whether that's a treaty organization or that is an intergovernmental organization like the EU. And so there's a calculation that is worth the benefits that are to be gained, whether that is visa liberalization or whether that is access to common markets or whether that is collective defense. And so those decisions have been made. Yes, the context has changed, but in terms of the collective defense that NATO continues to provide for Turkey, and remember that, of course, Turkey is not part of a pro-Russia bloc. Turkey is neither a close friend nor a clear enemy to Russia. It's kind of playing this middle ground, I think, of being able to cooperate while having a lot of issues on which it differs. And Azerbaijan and the Zangezur corridor right now is one of them, with Iran, of course. But there are ways in which I think that common goals, particular clear security goals, can be identified. And so I think thinking about those rather than sort of these larger concepts of values and interests might be the most productive way forward.
Okay, thank you. Sinem?
Turkey does not have a unique experience in NATO. I mean, yes, I totally agree with what Lizel said about creating a lot of tensions, a lot of crises, being on the headlines. Yes, indeed, that is true. But, you know, just a few examples. France once withdrew from the military arm of NATO, so as Greece. Trump talked about, you know, withdrawal from NATO. Macron talked about NATO's brain dead. So, I mean, there are times and countries that have complications in their position in NATO. So when states become member of international organizations, as Lizel mentioned, they make this cost-benefit analysis. And I mean, Turkey once made this decision because of its benefits. And then, you know, it transcends the cost-benefit analysis, and that membership to that international organization becomes a part of your foreign policy, becomes a part of your foreign policy identity, specifically in those institutions such as, you know, NATO or the EU. So it becomes a part of, or for countries in Africa, it is the African Union. I'm not going to generalize that much for time's sake. But of course, there are benefits of membership and there are, you know, costs of membership. And if the benefits still overweight, you know, then you continue the membership. So, and I mean, for Turkey, being a member of NATO has many benefits, specifically within the security context, within Turkey's position, Turkey's neighbors, and Turkey's all these complicated relationships. NATO's membership is very valuable for Turkey, for Turkish security, and also for Turkey's disciplining itself in terms of defense and its military. So it is valuable, I would say. I'm not responding to all of your questions because of the time limit.
Of course, of course. Thank you very much. And last but not least, yes.
Well, first of all, I have to object to any suggestion that Turkey is a weak link within the alliance. Sinem Hoca already shed light to Turkey's contributions, not only in efforts to boost collective defense of NATO, but taking part in every NATO operation and mission. Lately, we have increased our contingent in KFOR and also have undertaken the command of this operation. Now, regarding the benefits and what we provide NATO with, we talked about Turkey's contributions, but NATO certainly contributes to the security and defense of Turkey. NATO is providing a security guarantee to allies, which has been embodied in Article 5 of the Washington Treaty. Now, everybody is discussing how to provide security guarantees to Ukraine before its accession to NATO one day when it is possible. Well, Turkey already is in NATO, and we have invoked Article 4 consultations on critical instances, like the downing of a Russian fighter jet and then there was a strong supportive statement coming from NATO. And we are perhaps the only allied country who has used the possibility of convening North Atlantic Council for consultations under Article 4 on numerous occasions in recent history, whether it is related to Syria, events there or not. Therefore, Turkey's membership is in the center of Turkey's security considerations, no doubt about it. Sometimes in Turkey, when you watch TV discussions, the panels, unfortunately, the security experts who claim themselves to be security experts are not speaking on objective sort of realities, facts, but rather some of the thoughts that they may have accumulated throughout years, which I respect. Every view has to be respected, but they don't correspond to facts. And they have to provide the society an answer. If Turkey leaves NATO and let us assume joins Shanghai Cooperation Organization, what benefit Turkey would attain by such a departure from this alliance? Without providing a tangible answer to this question, I think all would be speculative, and I don't think that it would be realistic to base our projections for the future for Turkey without belonging to NATO. One last issue, since it was touched upon several times, NATO-EU cooperation. And again, in that context, Turkey, in many instances, is perceived as a spoiler, which is not true, because NATO-EU cooperation is based on the accumulated experience of the past, stemming from Western European Union. There is an EU acquis where non-EU allies have the right to be involved in the European Union's different security and defense projects. First thing is that NATO should be the cornerstone of European defense. Second, insofar as capability development is concerned, what EU is right now trying to do is something all has to applaud. But while doing so, non-EU allies like Turkey should be involved in different schemes like PESCO or European Defense Fund. And Turkey should not be seen as a spoiler, because as Professor Açıkmeşe already referred to, in 2004, there was a parallel, simultaneous referendum in Cyprus, and both communities, both peoples in the north and south casted their votes and expressed their opinion regarding the Annan plan, which would be bringing about a settlement to the long-standing Cyprus question. Well, the Turkish Cypriots accepted it, Greek Cypriots rejected, and the expectation of the European Union was for both communities to approve this Annan plan for settlement, and then accession of the Cyprus Republic could be possible. And remember Enlargement Commissioner, then Enlargement Commissioner Verheugen, talking about how he was deceived by the Greek Cypriots. But at the end of the day, because there was such a strong messages coming from one country within the Union, it was not possible to stop this process, and without the settlement of the Cyprus question, Cyprus Republic, the Greek Cypriots, were admitted as a new member of the Union. Therefore, sometimes we are with short memory without going back to the historical background of the issues that we are talking about or addressing. And it becomes quite convenient and easy to label a country as quote unquote a spoiler. With this, once again, I thank you for inviting me, and I enjoyed our discussion this evening, and hope that we will repeat in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. If you enjoyed this event, please follow the LSE European Institute on Twitter or X at LSEEI, and visit the Contemporary Turkish Studies website. The link was shared through the chat box. As Contemporary Turkish Studies, we have upcoming events on 7 March on the Syrian civil war, and on 7 June, we are going to organize the 5th LSE workshop on political economy of Turkey. For further information, you can visit the website and also follow us on Instagram and Facebook. Thank you very much to Tarcan Nildam, Sinem Akül Açıkmeşe, and Lizel Hinz for being with us today. And I'm perfectly aware that it's 11:15 in Turkey. So thank you for taking the time in the middle of the night and in your busy schedules. It was great listening to you, and I do hope that we will come together face to face in person soon. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.